The Great Queen, 1558 to 1603. 1. The Uses of Adversity. On November 17, 1558, a courier galloped into the court of the royal palace at Hatfield, 36 miles north of London, and announced to Elizabeth Tudor that she was Queen of England. Her half-sister Queen Mary, of pitiful fame, had died in the dark of that morning. In London, the Parliament, receiving the news, cried out, "God save Queen Elizabeth! Long may she reign over us!" not dreaming that it would be 45 years. The churches, though foreboding trouble, thrilled the air with the clangor of their bells. The people of England, as they had done for Mary, spread festive tables in the streets, and that evening they colored the sky with bonfires of eternal hope. By Saturday the 19th, the leading lords, ladies, and commoners of the realm had gathered at Hatfield to vow their allegiance and feather their nests. To them, on the 20th, Elizabeth spoke right royally. "My lords, the laws of nature move me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that has fallen upon me maketh me amazed. And yet, considering I am God's creature ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace to be the minister of his heavenly will in the office now committed to me. And as I am but one body materially considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all, my lords, chiefly you of the nobility, every one in his degree and power, to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling and you with your service may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth." On the 28th, clad in purple velvet, Elizabeth rode through London in public procession to that same tower where, 4 years earlier, she had been a prisoner awaiting death. Now, on her route, the populace acclaimed her, choruses chanted her glory, children tremblingly recited to her the little speeches of homage they had memorized, and "such shooting of guns as never was heard afore" heralded a reign destined to abound, beyond any English precedent, in splendor of men and minds. 25 years of trials had tempered Elizabeth to mastery. It seemed, in 1533, good fortune to have been fathered by Henry VIII, but it was dangerous to have been born of Anne Boleyn. The disgrace and execution of the mother fell within the child's forgetful years, 1536. Yet the pain of that somber heritage outlived her youth and yielded only to the balm of sovereignty. An Act of Parliament, 1536, declared Anne's marriage null, making Elizabeth illegitimate. Coarse gossip debated the girl's paternity. In any case, to most Englishmen she was the daughter of adultery. Her legitimacy was never re-established in law, but another Act of Parliament, 1544, confirmed her right, after her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary, to succeed to the throne. During Edward's rule, 1547–53, she adhered to the Protestant worship, but when Catholic Mary acceded, Elizabeth, preferring life to consistency, conformed to the Roman ritual. After Wyatt's rebellion, 1554, had failed to unseat Mary, Elizabeth was accused of complicity and was sent to the Tower. But Mary judged her guilt unproved and released her to live under surveillance at Woodstock. Before Mary died, she recognized her sister as her successor and sent her the jewels of the crown. We owe Elizabeth's reign to the kindliness of the bloody queen. Elizabeth's more formal education was overwhelming. Her famous tutor, Roger Ascham, boasted that she talks French and Italian as well as she does English, and has often talked to me readily and well in Latin, moderately in Greek. She had a daily stint of theology and became expert in Protestant dogma, but her Italian teachers seemed to have transmitted to her something of the skepticism they had imbibed from Pomponazzi, Machiavelli, and Renaissance Rome. She was never sure of her crown. Parliament, 1553, had reaffirmed the invalidity of her mother's marriage to her father. State and Church agreed that she was a bastard, and English law, ignoring William the Conqueror, excluded bastards from the throne. The whole Catholic world, and England was still largely Catholic, believed that the legal heir to the English sceptre was Mary Stuart, great-granddaughter of Henry VII. It was intimated to Elizabeth that if she made her peace with the Church, the Pope would wash her free of bastardy and recognize her right to rule. She was not so inclined. Thousands of Englishmen held property that had been expropriated from the Church by Parliament under Henry VIII and Edward VI. These influential possessors, fearing that a continued Catholic restoration might enforce restitution, were prepared to fight for a Protestant queen, and the Catholics of England preferred her to civil war. On January 15, 1559, amid the acclamation of Protestant London, Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey as Queen of England, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith. For English monarchs since Edward III had regularly claimed the throne of France. Nothing had been left undone to provide the Queen with problems. She was now 25, in all the charm of maturing womanhood. She was moderately tall, with a good figure, fair features, olive complexion, flashing eyes, auburn hair, and beautiful hands which she knew how to display. It seemed impossible that such a lass should cope successfully with the chaos that encompassed her. Hostile creeds divided the land, playing for power and wielding arms. Pauperism was endemic, and vagrancy had survived the terrible penalties laid upon it by Henry VIII. Domestic trade was clogged by a dishonest currency. Half a century of false coinage had left the credit of the fisc so low that the government had to pay 14% for loans. Mary Tudor, absorbed in religion, had skimped on national defense. The fortresses were neglected, the coasts unprotected, the navy unfit, the army ill-paid and ill-fed, and its cadres unfilled. England, which under Wolsey had held the balance of power in Europe, was now a political cripple bandied about between Spain and France. French troops were in Scotland, and Ireland was inviting Spain. The Pope was holding over the Queen's head the threat of excommunication and interdict, and of invasion by the Catholic states. Invasion definitely loomed in 1559, and fear of assassination was part of Elizabeth's life from day to day. She was saved by the disunion of her enemies, the wisdom of her counselors, and the courage of her soul. The Spanish ambassador was shocked by the spirit of the woman. She is possessed of the devil, who is dragging her to his place. Europe had not expected to find the spirit of an emperor behind the smiles of a girl. 2. Elizabethan government. Her penetration proved itself at once in her choice of aides. Like her embattled father, and despite her political speech at Hatfield, she chose men of untitled birth, for most of the older nobles were Catholic, and some thought themselves fitter than she to wear the crown. As her secretary and principal adviser, she named William Cecil, whose genius for prudent policy and assiduous detail became so outstanding a factor in her success that those who did not know her thought him king. His grandfather was a prosperous yeoman become country gentleman. His father was yeoman of the wardrobe to Henry VIII. His mother's dowry raised the family to a comfortable estate. William left Cambridge without a degree, took law at Gray's Inn, sowed his wild oats in London's common fields, entered the House of Commons at 23, 1543, and married as his second wife Mildred Cooke, whose grim Puritanism helped him toe the Protestant line. He served Protector Somerset, then Somerset's enemy Northumberland. He supported Lady Jane Grey to succeed Edward VI, but switched to Mary Tudor in the nick of time. He became a conforming Catholic at her suggestion, and was appointed by her to welcome Cardinal Pole into England. He was a man of affairs who did not allow his theological somersaults to disturb his political equilibrium. When Elizabeth made him her secretary, she addressed him with her usual sagacity. "I give you this charge, that you shall be of my privy council, and content to take pains for me and my realm. This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted by any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state, and that without respect of my private will you will give me that counsel which you think best, and if you shall know anything necessary to be declared to me of secrecy, you shall show it to myself only, and assure yourself I will not fail to keep taciturnity therein, and therefore herewith I charge you. The test of his fidelity and competence is that she kept him as secretary for 14 years, then as Lord Treasurer for 26 more, till his death. He presided over the council, managed foreign relations, directed public finance and national defense, and guided Elizabeth in the definitive establishment of Protestantism in England. Like Richelieu, he thought the safety and stability of his country required the unifying absolutism of the monarch as against the divisive ambitions of contentious nobles, covetous merchants, and fratricidal faiths. He had some Machiavellian ways, rarely cruel but relentless against opposition. Once he thought of having the Earl of Westmoreland assassinated. But that was an impatient moment in a half-century of patient tenacity and personal rectitude. He had eyes and spies for everything, but eternal vigilance is the price of power. He was acquisitive and thrifty, but Elizabeth pardoned his wealth for his wisdom, and loved the parsimony that accumulated the means for defeating the Armada. Without him she might have been misled by such lighter lights and spendthrift peacocks as Leicester, Hatton, and Essex. Cecil, reported the Spanish ambassador, has more genius than the rest of the council put together, and is therefore envied and hated on all sides. Elizabeth sometimes listened to his enemies, and now and then treated him so harshly that he left her presence broken and in tears. But she knew, when out of her tantrums, that he was the steadiest pillar of her reign. In 1571 she made him Lord Burleigh, head of the new aristocracy that, in the face of hostile nobles, upheld her throne and made her kingdom great. Her minor aids deserve a line even in hurried history, for they served her with competence, courage, and scant remuneration to the exhaustion of their lives. Sir Nicholas Bacon, father of Francis, was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal from the outset of the reign till his death, 1579. Sir Francis Knowles was Privy Councillor from 1558 and Treasurer of the Royal Household till his end, 1596. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton was her skilful ambassador in France, and Thomas Randolph in Scotland, Russia, and Germany. Only next to Cecil in devotion and craft was Sir Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State from 1573 to his death, 1590, a man of sensitive refinement whom Spencer called the great Maecenas of his age, so shocked by repeated plots against the Queen's life that he formed for her protection a web of espionage that stretched from Edinburgh to Constantinople and caught in its skein the tragic Queen of Scots. Seldom has a ruler had servitors so able, so loyal, and so poorly paid. For the English government itself was poor. Private fortunes outshone public funds. The revenue in 1600 totaled £500,000, which even now would be a paltry $25 million. Elizabeth seldom levied direct taxes, and she took in only £36,000 in customs dues. Ordinarily, she relied on income from Crown lands, on grants in aid from the English Church, and on loans from the rich, which were practically compulsory but punctually repaid. She honored the debts left by her father, her brother, and her sister, and acquired such a reputation for solvency that she could borrow money at Antwerp at 5%, while Philip II of Spain at times could not borrow at all. She was extravagant, however, in her expenditure for dresses and finery, and in gifts of economic privileges to her favorites. Rarely and reluctantly she summoned Parliament to her financial aid, for she did not patiently bear opposition, criticism, or surveillance. She put no stock in theories of popular or parliamentary sovereignty. She believed with Homer and Shakespeare that only one head should rule, and why not hers, in which ran the blood and burned the pride of Henry VIII? She held to the divine right of kings and queens. She imprisoned persons at her own sharp will, without trial or stated cause, and her Privy Council, acting as the Court of Star Chamber to try political offenders, suspended without appeal the rights of habeas corpus and jury trial. She punished MPs who obstructed her purposes. She suggested to the local magnates who manipulated elections to Parliament that it would facilitate matters if they chose candidates with no boyish notions about free speech. She wanted pounds without palaver. Her early parliaments yielded gracefully. Her middle parliaments yielded angrily. Her later parliaments neared revolt. She got her will because the nation preferred her judicious absolutism to the fury of factions competing for power. No one thought of letting the people rule. Politics was, as always, a contest of minorities to determine which should rule the majority. Half of England resented Elizabeth's religious policy. Nearly all England resented her celibacy. But by and large the people, grateful for low taxes, flourishing trade, domestic order, and prolonged peace, returned the affection offered them by the Queen. She gave them pageants and progresses, listened to them without visible boredom, shared in their public games, and in 100 other ways fished for men's souls. The Spanish ambassador, while bemoaning her Protestantism, wrote to Philip, "She is much attached to the people, and is confident that they are all on her side, which is indeed true." The attempts that were made on her life strengthened her popularity and power. Even the Puritans whom she persecuted prayed for her safety, and the anniversary of her accession became a day of national thanksgiving and festival. Was she the actual ruler, or only a popular front for the lower nobility of England and the mercantile oligarchy of London? Her aides, though fearing her temper, often corrected her mistakes of policy, but she often corrected theirs. They told her disagreeable truths, gave her their contradictory counsels, and obeyed her decisions. They governed, but she ruled. "She gives her orders," reported the Spanish ambassador, "and has her way as absolutely as her father." Cecil himself seldom knew how she would decide, and he fretted over her frequent rejection of his laborious and meticulous advice. When he urged her not to treat with France, but to rely solely on Protestant support, she pulled him up with some asperity. "Mr. Secretary, I mean to have done with this business. I shall listen to the proposals of the French king. I am not going to be tied any longer to you and your brethren in Christ." Her statesmanship drove both friends and enemies to tears. She was maddeningly slow and irresolute in determining policy, but in many cases her indecision paid. She knew how to ally herself with time, which dissolves more problems than men solve. Her procrastination allowed the complex factors in a situation to settle themselves into focus and clarity. She admired the fabled philosopher who, when importuned for an answer, silently recited the alphabet before replying. She took as her motto, "Video et taceo," I see and am silent. She discovered that in politics, as in love, he who does not hesitate is lost. If her policy often fluctuated, so did the facts and forces to be weighed. Surrounded by perils and intrigues, she felt her way with forgivable caution, trying now one course, now another, and making no claim to consistency in so fluid a world. Her vacillations stumbled into some serious errors, but it kept England at peace until it was strong enough for war. Inheriting a nation politically in chaos and militarily in decay, her only practicable policy was to keep England's enemies from uniting against it, to encourage the Huguenot revolt against the French monarchy, the Netherlands revolt against Spain, the Protestant revolt against a Scottish queen too closely bound to France. It was an unscrupulous policy, but Elizabeth believed with Machiavelli that scruples are not becoming in rulers responsible for states. By whatever means her subtle weakness could devise, she preserved her country from foreign domination, maintained peace, with some brief intervals, for 30 years, and left England richer than ever before in matter and mind. As a diplomat, she could give the foreign secretaries of the age many a lesson in alert information, resourceful expedients, and incalculable moves. She was the ablest liar of her time. Of the four women, Mary Tudor, Mary Stuart, Catherine de Médicis, and Elizabeth, who illustrated Knox's monstrous regiment, rule, of women in the second half of the 16th century, Elizabeth was unquestionably supreme in political acumen and diplomatic skill. Cecil thought her the wisest woman that ever was, for she understood the interest and dispositions of all the princes in her time, and was so perfect in the knowledge of her own realm that no counselor she had could tell her anything she did not know before, which, of course, requires a grain of salt. She had the advantage of conferring directly with ambassadors in French, Italian, or Latin, and was thereby independent of interpreters and intermediaries. "This woman," said the Spanish ambassador, "is possessed with 100,000 devils. Yet she pretends to me that she would like to be a nun, live in a cell, and tell her beads from morning till night." Every continental government condemned and admired her. If she were not a heretic, said Pope Sixtus V, she would be worth the whole world. 3. The Amorous Virgin. The secret weapon of her diplomacy was her virginity. This condition, of course, is a recondite detail on which historians must not pretend to certainty. Let us be as trustful as Raleigh naming a colony. Cecil, watching Elizabeth's long flirtation with Leicester, had some passing doubts, but two Spanish ambassadors, not loath to dishonor the Queen, concluded to her honor. The gossip of the court, as reported by Ben Jonson to Drummond of Hawthornden, held that she had a membrane on her which made her incapable of man, though for her delight she tried many. A French surgeon undertook to cut it, yet fear stayed her. The people, wrote Camden in his Annales, 1615, cursed Hewick, the Queen's physician, as having dissuaded the Queen from marrying on account of some impediment and defect in her. Yet Parliament, repeatedly begging her to marry, assumed her capacity to bear. Something went wrong in this regard with most of Tudor royalty. Probably the misfortunes of Catherine of Aragon in childbirth were due to Henry VIII's syphilis. His son Edward died in youth of some ill-described disease. His daughter Mary tried fervently to have a child, only to mistake dropsy for pregnancy, and Elizabeth, though she flirted as long as she could walk, never ventured on marriage. "I have always shrunk from it," she said, and as early as 1559 she declared her intention to remain a virgin. In 1566 she promised Parliament, "I will marry as soon as I can conveniently, and I hope to have children." But in that same year, when Cecil told her that Mary Stuart had borne a son, Elizabeth almost wept, and said, "The Queen of Scots is the mother of a fair son, and I am but a barren stock." There for a moment she revealed her lasting grief, that she could not fulfill her womanhood. The political implications deepened the tragedy. Many of her Catholic subjects believed her sterility a proper punishment for her father's sins, and a promise that Catholic Mary Stuart would inherit the crown. But Parliament and the rest of Protestant England dreaded such a prospect, and importuned her to find a mate. She tried, but began by losing her heart to a married man. Lord Robert Dudley, tall, handsome, accomplished, courtly, brave, was the son of that Duke of Northumberland who had died on the scaffold for trying to disinherit Mary Tudor and make Jane Grey queen. Dudley was married to Amy Robsart, but was not living with her, and rumour called him an unprincipled philanderer. He was with Elizabeth at Windsor when his wife fell downstairs at Cumnor Hall and died of a broken neck, 1560. He and the Queen were suspected by the Spanish ambassador and others of having arranged this clumsy annulment. The suspicion was unjust, but it ended for a while Dudley's hopes of becoming consort to Elizabeth. When she thought she was dying, 1562, she begged that he might be appointed protector of the realm. She confessed that she had long loved him, but called God to witness that nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. 2 years later she offered him to the Queen of Scots and made him Earl of Leicester to enhance his charms, but Mary was loath to have her rival's lover in her bed. Elizabeth comforted him with monopolies and favored him till his death, 1588. Cecil had borne this romance with dignified hostility. For a time he thought of resigning in protest, for his own plan contemplated a marriage that would strengthen England with the friendship of some powerful state. For a quarter of a century a succession of foreign suitors danced about the Queen. "There are 12 ambassadors of us," wrote one of them, "all competing for Her Majesty's hand. And the Duke of Holstein is coming next as a suitor for the King of Denmark. The Duke of Finland, who is here for his brother the King of Sweden, threatens to kill the Emperor's man, and the Queen fears they will cut each other's throat in her presence." She must have felt some satisfaction when Philip II, the greatest potentate in Christendom, offered her his seasoned hand, 1559. But she rejected this device for making England a Catholic dependency of Spain. She took more time in answering a proposal from Charles IX of France, for France was meanwhile kept on good behavior. The French ambassador complained that the world had been made in 6 days, and she had already spent 80 days and was still undecided. She artfully replied that the world had been made by a greater artist than herself. 2 years later she allowed English agents to propose her marriage to Charles, Archduke of Austria. But at Leicester's urging she withdrew the plan. When the international situation favored humoring France, 1570, the Duke of Alençon, son of Henri II and Catherine de Médicis, was encouraged to think of becoming the 16-year-old husband of the 37-year-old Queen. But the negotiations were wrecked on 3 obstacles: the Duke's Catholic faith, his tender youth, and his pockmarked nose. 5 years softened one of these deterrents, and Alençon, now Duke of Anjou, was considered again. He was invited to London, and for 5 years more Elizabeth played with him in France. After a final flurry, 1581, this gay courtship petered out, and Anjou retired from the field waving as a trophy a garter of the Queen. Meanwhile, she had kept him from marrying the Infanta, and thereby allying her 2 enemies, France and Spain. Rarely has a woman derived so much advantage from barrenness, or so much pleasure from virginity. 4. Elizabeth and her court. There was more satisfaction in being courted by virile Elizabethans than in being bedded by epoxy youth, and the courtship could last as long as marriage did not stifle it. Hence Elizabeth enjoyed perennial adulation and savored it insatiably. Lords ruined themselves to entertain her. Masks and pageants allegorized her glory. Poets smothered her with sonnets and dedications. Musicians strummed her praise. A madrigal celebrated her eyes as war-subduing orbs, and her breast as that fair hill where virtue dwells and sacred skill. Raleigh told her that she walked like Venus, hunted like Diana, rode like Alexander, sang like an angel, and played like Orpheus. She almost believed it. She was as vain as if all the merits of her England were the blessed fruit of her mothering, and to a degree they were. Distrustful of her physical charms, she robed herself in costly dresses, varying them almost every day. At her death, she left 2,000. She wore jewelry in her hair, on her arms and wrists and ears, and gowns. When a bishop reproved her love of finery, she had him warned not to touch on that subject again, lest he reach heaven aforetime. Her manners could be alarming. She cuffed or fondled courtiers, even foreign emissaries. She tickled the back of Dudley's neck when he knelt to receive his earldom. She spat, as she list, once upon a costly coat. She was usually amiable and easy of access, but she talked volubly, and she could be an unanswerable shrew. She swore like a pirate, which, by proxy, she was. By God's death was among her milder oaths. She could be cruel, as in playing cat and mouse with Mary Stuart, or letting Lady Catherine Grey languish and die in the Tower. But she was basically kind and merciful, and she mingled tenderness with her blows. She often lost her temper, but she soon regained control of herself. She roared with laughter when amused, which was often. She loved to dance, and pirouetted till she was 69. She gamboled and gambled, and hunted and was fond of masks and plays. She kept her spirits up even when her fortunes were low, and in the face of danger she was all courage and intelligence. She was abstemious in food and drink, but covetous of money and jewelry. With relish she confiscated the property of rich rebels, and she managed to get and to hold the crown jewels of Scotland, Burgundy, and Portugal, besides a hoard of gems presented by expectant lords. She was not renowned for gratitude or liberality. Sometimes she tried to pay her servants in fair words, but there was a certain patriotism in her parsimony and her pride. When she exceeded, there was hardly a nation so poor as to do England reverence. When she died, England controlled the seas and challenged the intellectual hegemony of Italy or France. What sort of mind did she have? She had all the learning that a queen could carry gracefully. While ruling England, she continued her study of languages, corresponded in French with Mary Stuart, bandied Italian with a Venetian ambassador, and berated a Polish envoy in virile Latin. She translated Sallust and Boethius, and knew enough Greek to read Sophocles and translate a play of Euripides's. She claimed to have read as many books as any prince in Christendom, and it was likely. She studied history almost every day. She composed poetry and music, and played forgivably on the lute and the virginal. But she had sense enough to laugh at her accomplishments, and to distinguish between education and intelligence. When an ambassador complimented her on her languages, she remarked that it was no marvel to teach a woman to talk. It were far harder to teach her to hold her tongue. Her mind was as sharp as her speech, and her wit kept pace with the time. Francis Bacon reported that she was wont to say of her instructions to great officers that they were like to garments, straight at the first putting on, but did by and by wear loose enough. Her letters and speeches were composed in an English all her own, devious, involved, and affected, but rich in quaint turns, fascinating in eloquence and character. She excelled in intelligence rather than intellect. Walsingham pronounced her inapt to embrace any matter of weight, but perhaps he spoke in the bitterness of unrequited devotion. Her skill lay in feminine delicacy and subtlety of perception, not in laborious logic, and sometimes the outcome revealed more wisdom in her feline tentatives than in their reasoning. It was her indefinable spirit that counted, that baffled Europe and enthralled England, that gave spur and color to her country's flowering. She re-established the Reformation, but she represented the Renaissance, the lust to live this earthly life to the full, to enjoy and embellish it every day. She was no exemplar of virtue, but she was a paragon of vitality. Sir John Hayward, whom she sent to the Tower for giving rebellious notions to the younger Essex, forgave her enough to write of her 9 years after she could reward him. Now, if ever any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of people, it was this queen. If ever she did express the same, it was in coupling mildness with majesty as she did, and in stately stooping to the meanest sort. All her faculties were in motion, and every motion seemed a well-guided action. Her eyes were set upon one, her ears listened to another, her judgment ran upon a third, to a fourth she addressed her speech. Her spirit seemed to be everywhere, and yet so entire in herself as it seemed to be nowhere else. Some she pitied, some she commended, some she thanked, at others she pleasantly and wittingly jested, contemning no person, neglecting no office, and distributing her smiles, looks, and graces so artificially, artfully, that thereupon the people again redoubled the testimonies of their joys. Her court was her character, loving the things she loved and raising her flair from music, games, plays, and vivid speech to an ecstasy of poems, madrigals, dramas, and masques, and such prose as England has never known again. In her palaces at Whitehall, Windsor, Greenwich, Richmond, and Hampton Court, lords and ladies, knights and ambassadors, entertainers and servitors, moved in an exciting alternation of regal ceremony and gallant gaiety. A special office of the revels prepared amusements that ranged from riddles and backgammon to complex masques and Shakespeare's plays. Ascension Day, Christmas, New Year's, Twelfth Night, Candlemas, and Shrovetide were regularly celebrated with pastimes, athletic contests, jousts, mummings, plays, and masks. The mask was one of many Italian importations into Elizabethan England, a gaudy mixture of pageantry, poetry, music, allegory, buffoonery, and ballet, put together by playwrights and artists, presented at court or on rich estates, with complex machinery and evolutions, and performed by masked ladies and gentlemen burdened with costly costumes and simple lines. Elizabeth was fond of drama, especially of comedy. Who knows how much of Shakespeare would have reached the stage, or posterity, if she and Leicester had not supported the theatre through all the attacks of the Puritans. Not content with her 5 palaces, Elizabeth sallied out almost every summer on cross-country progresses, to see and be seen, to keep an eye on her vassal lords, and to enjoy their reluctant homage. Part of the court followed her, delighted with the change and grumbling at the accommodations and the beer. Towns dressed their gentry in velvet and silk to welcome her with speeches and gifts. Nobles bankrupted themselves to entertain her. Hard-pressed lords prayed that she would not come their way. The Queen rode on horseback or in an open litter, greeting happily the crowds that gathered along the road. The people were thrilled by the sight of their invincible sovereign, and bewitched to fresh loyalty by her gracious compliments and infectious happiness. The court took on her gaiety, her freedom of manners, her luxury of dress, her love of ceremony, and her ideal of the gentleman. She liked to hear the rustle of finery, and the men around her rivaled the women in molding Oriental stuffs to Italian styles. Pleasure was the usual program, but one had to be ready at any moment for martial exploits beyond the seas. Seductions had to be circumspect, for Elizabeth felt responsible to the parents of her maids of honor for their honor. Hence she banished the Earl of Pembroke from the court for making Mary Fitton pregnant. As at any court, intrigue wove many entangling webs. The women competed unscrupulously for the men for the women, and all for the favor of the Queen and the perquisites dependent thereon. Those same gentlemen who exalted in poetry the refinements of love and morality, itched in prose for sinecures, took or gave bribes, grasped at monopolies, or shared in piratical spoils, and the avid Queen looked indulgently upon a venality that eked out the inadequate pay of her servitors. Through her grants or by her permission, Leicester became the richest lord in England. Sir Philip Sidney received vast tracts in America. Raleigh acquired 40,000 acres in Ireland. The second Earl of Essex enjoyed a corner on the importation of sweet wines, and Sir Christopher Hatton rose from the Queen's lapdog to Lord Chancellor. Elizabeth was no more sensitive to industrious brains than to handsome legs, for these pillars of society were not yet shrouded in pantaloons. Despite her faults, she set a pace and a course to elicit the reserve energies of England's worthies. She raised their courage to high enterprise, their minds to brave thinking, their manners to grace and wit and the fostering of poetry, drama, and art. Around that dazzling court and woman gathered nearly all the genius of England's greatest age. 5. Elizabeth and Religion. But within the court and through the nation, the bitter battle of the Reformation raged, and created a problem that many thought would baffle and destroy the Queen. She was a Protestant. The country was 2/3, perhaps 3/4 Catholic. Most of the magistrates, all of the clergy, were Catholic. The Protestants were confined to the southern ports and industrial towns. They were predominant in London, where their number was swelled by refugees from oppression on the continent. But in the northern and western counties, almost entirely agricultural, they were a negligible few. The spirit of the Protestants, however, was immeasurably more ardent than the Catholic. In 1559, John Fox published his Rerum in Ecclesia Gestarum Commentant, describing with passion the sufferings of Protestants under the preceding reign. The volumes were translated, 1563, as Acts and Monuments, Popularly known as the Book of Martyrs, they had an arousing influence on English Protestants for over a century. Protestantism in the 16th century had the feverish energy of a new idea fighting for the future. Catholicism had the strength of traditional beliefs and ways deeply rooted in the past. In a spreading minority, the religious turmoil had generated skepticism, even, here and there, atheism. The conflict of creeds, their mutual criticism, their bloody intolerance, and the contrast between the professions and the conduct of Christians had made some matter-of-fact minds doubtful of all theologies. Hear Roger Ascham's Schoolmaster, 1563. That Italian that first invented the Italian proverb against our Englishmen Italianate meant no more their vanity in living than their lewd opinion in religion. They make more account of Tully's offices, Cicero's De Officiis, than St. Paul's epistles, of a tale in Boccaccio than a story of the Bible. Then they count as fables the holy mysteries of the Christian religion. They make Christ and his gospel only serve civil policy. Then neither religion, Protestantism or Catholicism, cometh amiss to them. In time they be promoters of both openly, in place again mockers of both privily. For where they dare, in company where they like, they boldly laugh to scorn both Protestant and Papist. They care for no scripture, they mock the Pope, they rail on Luther. The heaven they desire is only their personal pleasure and private profit, whereby they plainly declare of whose school they be, that is, Epicures in living, and Atheoi in doctrine. Cecil complained, 1569, that deriders of religion, Epicureans and atheists are everywhere. John Strype declared, 1571, that many were wholly departed from the communion of the Church, and came no more to hear divine service. John Lilly, 1579, thought, there never were such sects among the heathens, such misbelief among infidels as is now among scholars. Theologians and others wrote books against atheism, which, however, could mean belief in God but disbelief in Christ's divinity. In 1579, 1583, and 1589, men were burned for denying the divinity of Christ. Several dramatists, Greene, Kidd, Marlowe, were reputed atheists. The Elizabethan drama, which otherwise so widely pictures life, contains remarkably little about the strife of faiths, but makes a great play of pagan mythology. In Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, Act 4, Scene 3, line 250, are two obscure lines. O paradox! Black is the badge of hell, the hue of dungeons, and the school of night. Many have interpreted the last phrase as referring to the evening assemblies of Walter Raleigh, the astronomer Thomas Harriot, the scholar Lawrence Keymis, probably the poets Marlowe and Chapman, and some others, in Raleigh's country house at Sherborne, for the study of astronomy, geography, chemistry, philosophy, and theology. Harriot, apparently the intellectual leader of the group, had strange thoughts of the Scriptures, reported the antiquary Anthony Wood, and always undervalued the old story of the creation. He made a philosophical theology wherein he cast off the Old Testament. He believed in God but rejected revelation and the divinity of Christ. Robert Parsons, the Jesuit, wrote in 1592 of Sir Walter Raleigh's School of Atheism, wherein both Moses and our Savior, the Old and New Testaments, are jested at, and the scholars taught to spell God backwards. Raleigh was accused of having listened to Marlowe's reading of an essay on atheism. In March 1594, a government commission sat at Cerne Abbas, Dorset, to investigate rumors of a set of atheists in the vicinity, which included Raleigh's home. The inquiry led to no action now known to us, but charges of atheism were brought against Raleigh during his trial, 1603. In the preface to his History of the World, he made it a point to enlarge upon his belief in God. Some suspicion of freethinking clings to Elizabeth herself. "No woman," said John Richard Green, "ever lived who was so totally destitute of the sentiment of religion." Elizabeth, in Froude's judgment, was without distinct emotional conviction. Elizabeth, to whom the Protestant creed was as little true as the Catholic, had a latitudinarian contempt for theological dogmatism. She called upon God, with terrible oaths that horrified her ministers, to destroy her if she did not keep her promise to marry Alençon, while in private she jested over his pretensions to her hand. She declared to a Spanish envoy that the difference between the warring Christian creeds was a mere bagatelle, whereupon he concluded that she was an atheist. Nevertheless, she took it for granted, like almost all governments before 1789, that some religion, some supernatural source and sanction of morality, was indispensable to social order and the stability of the state. For a time, till she had consolidated her position, she appeared to hesitate, and she played upon the hopes of Catholic potentates that she might be won to their public faith. She liked the Catholic ceremony, the celibacy of the clergy, the drama of the Mass, and she might have made her peace with the Church had not this involved submission to the papacy. She distrusted Catholicism as a foreign power that might lead Englishmen to put loyalty to the Church above allegiance to the Queen. She had been reared in the Protestantism of her father, which was Catholicism minus the papacy, and this is essentially what she decided to re-establish in England. She hoped that the semi-Catholic liturgy of her Anglican Church would mollify the Catholics of the countryside, while the rejection of the papacy would satisfy the Protestants of the towns. Meanwhile, state control of education would form the new generation to this Elizabethan settlement, and the disruptive religious strife would be quieted into peace. She made her hesitations in religion, as in marriage, serve her political purposes. She kept potential enemies bemused and divided until she could face them with an accomplished fact. Many forces urged her to complete the Reformation. Continental reformers wrote to thank her in advance for restoring the new worship, and their letters touched her. Holders of formerly church property prayed for a Protestant settlement. Cecil urged Elizabeth to make herself the leader of all Protestant Europe. London Protestants indicated their sentiments by beheading a statue of St. Thomas and casting it into the street. Her first Parliament, January 23 to May 8, 1559, was overwhelmingly Protestant. The funds she asked for were voted without reservation or delay, and to raise them a tax was laid upon all persons, ecclesiastical or secular. A new Act of Uniformity, April 28, 1559, made Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, revised, the law of English liturgy, and forbade all other religious ritual. The Mass was abolished. All Englishmen were required to attend the Sunday service of the Anglican Church, or forfeit a shilling for the succor of the poor. A new Act of Supremacy, April 29th, declared Elizabeth to be the supreme governor of England in all matters, spiritual or temporal. An oath of supremacy acknowledging the religious sovereignty of the Queen was required of all clergymen, lawyers, teachers, university graduates, and magistrates, and all employees of the Church or the Crown. All major ecclesiastical appointments and decisions were to be made by an ecclesiastical court of high commission chosen by the government. Any defense of papal authority over England was to be punished by life imprisonment for the first offense, by death for the second, 1563. By 1590, all English churches were Protestant. Elizabeth pretended that she was not persecuting opinion. Any man, she said, might think and believe as he pleased, provided he obeyed the laws. All she asked was external conformity for the sake of national unity. Cecil assured her that that state could never be in safety where there was toleration of two religions, which did not deter Elizabeth from demanding toleration of French Protestants in Catholic France. She had no objection to peaceful hypocrisy, but freedom of opinion was not to be freedom of speech. Preachers who disagreed with her views on any important subject were silenced or dismissed. The laws against heresy were redefined and enforced. Unitarians and Anabaptists were outlawed. 5 heretics were burned during the reign, which seemed a modest number in its day. In 1563, a convocation of theologians defined the new creed. All were agreed on predestination. God, of his own free will, before the creation of the world, and without regard to individual human merit or demerit, had chosen some of mankind to be elect and saved, leaving all the rest to be reprobate and damned. They accepted Lutheran justification, salvation, by faith. That is, the elect were saved not by their good works, but by belief in the grace of God and the redeeming blood of Christ. However, they interpreted the Eucharist in Calvin's sense as a spiritual rather than a physical communion with Christ. By an Act of Parliament, 1566, the 39 articles embodying the new theology were made obligatory on all the clergy of England, and they still express the official Anglican creed. The new ritual, too, was a compromise. The Mass was abolished, but to the horror of the Puritans, the clergy were instructed to wear white surplices in reading the service and copes in administering the Eucharist. Communion was to be received kneeling, in the 2 forms of bread and wine. The invocation of saints was replaced by annual commemoration of Protestant heroes. Confirmation and ordination were retained as sacred rites, but were not viewed as sacraments instituted by Christ, and confession to a priest was encouraged only in expectation of death. Many of the prayers kept Roman Catholic forms, but took on English dress and became a noble and formative part of the nation's literature. For 400 years these prayers and hymns, recited by congregation and priest in the spacious splendor of cathedrals or the simple dignity of the parish church, have given English families inspiration, consolation, moral discipline, and mental peace. 6. Elizabeth and the Catholics. It was now the turn of the Catholics to suffer persecution. Though still in the majority, they were forbidden to hold Catholic services or possess Catholic literature. Religious images in the churches were destroyed by government order, and altars were removed. 6 Oxford students were sent to the Tower for resisting the removal of a crucifix from their college chapel. Most Catholics submitted sadly to the new regulations, but a considerable number preferred to pay the fines for non-attendance at the Anglican ritual. The Royal Council calculated some 50,000 such recusants in England, 1580. Anglican bishops complained to the government that Mass was being said in private homes, that Catholicism was emerging into public worship, and that in some ardent localities it was unsafe to be a Protestant. Elizabeth rebuked Archbishop Parker for laxity, 1565, and thereafter the laws were more rigorously enforced. Catholics who had heard Mass in the chapel of the Spanish ambassador were imprisoned. Houses in London were searched. Strangers found there were ordered to give an account of their religion. Magistrates were commanded to punish all persons possessing books of Roman Catholic theology, 1567. We must not judge this legislation in terms of the relative religious toleration earned for us by the philosophers and revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. The faiths were then at war and were entangled with politics, a field in which toleration has always been limited. All parties and governments in the 16th century agreed that theological dissent was a form of political revolt. The religious conflict became explicitly political when Pope Pius V, after what he felt had been a long and patient delay, issued a bull, 1570, that not only excommunicated Elizabeth, but absolved her subjects from allegiance to her, and forbade them to obey her monitions, mandates, and laws. The bull was suppressed in France and Spain, which were then seeking friendship with England, but a copy of it was clandestinely posted on the door of the episcopal residence in London. The culprit was discovered and put to death. Faced by this declaration of war, the Queen's ministers asked Parliament for stricter anti-Catholic laws. Statutes were passed making it a capital crime to call the Queen a heretic, schismatic, usurper, or tyrant, or to introduce a papal bull into England, or to convert a Protestant to the Roman Church. The Court of High Commission was authorized to examine the opinions of any suspected person and to punish any of his unpunished offenses against any law, including fornication or adultery. The Catholic monarchs of Europe could not with much face protest against these oppressive measures, which so resembled their own. Most English Catholics continued to submit peaceably, and Elizabeth's government hoped that habit would generate acceptance and, in time, belief. It was to prevent this that William Allen, an émigré Englishman, founded at Douay, then in the Spanish Netherlands, a college and seminary to train English Catholics for missionary service in England. He expounded his purpose fervently. "We make it our first and foremost study to stir up in the minds of Catholics zeal and just indignation against the heretics. This we do by setting before the eyes of the students the exceeding majesty of the ceremonial of the Catholic Church in the place where we live. At the same time, we recall the mournful contrast that obtains at home, the utter desolation of all things sacred which there exists. Our friends and kinsfolk, all our dear ones, and countless souls besides, perishing in schism and godlessness. Every jail and dungeon filled to overflowing, not with thieves and villains, but with Christ's priests and servants, nay, with our parents and kinsmen. There is nothing, then, that we ought not to suffer, rather than to look on at the ills that affect our nation." The college functioned at Douay till 1578, when the Calvinists captured the town, then at Reims, then again at Douay, 1593. The Douay Bible, an English translation of the Latin Vulgate, was produced at Reims and Douay, 1582 to 1610, and reached publication a year before the King James Version. Between 1574 and 1585, the college ordained 275 graduates and sent 268 to labor in England. Allen was called to Rome and made a cardinal, but the work went on. 170 additional priests were dispatched to England before Elizabeth's death in 1603. Of the 438 total, 98 suffered the capital penalty. The leadership of the missionaries passed to a Jesuit, Robert Parsons, a man of enthusiasm and courage, a firebrand of polemics, and a master of English prose. He frankly announced that the bull deposing Elizabeth justified her assassination. Many English Catholics were shocked, but Tolomeo Gali, Secretary of State to Pope Gregory XIII, gave the idea his approval. Parsons urged the Catholic powers to invade England. The Spanish ambassador in England condemned the plan as criminal folly, and Everard Mercurian, general of the Jesuit order, forbade Parsons to meddle in politics. Undeterred, he decided on a personal invasion. He disguised himself as an English officer returning from service in the Netherlands. His martial swagger, gold lace coat, and feathered hat carried him through the frontier officials, 1580. He even smoothed the way for another Jesuit, Edmund Campion, to follow him in the guise of a jewel merchant. They were secretly housed in the heart of London. They visited imprisoned Catholics and found them leniently treated. Recruiting lay and sacerdotal aides, they began their work of inspiring Catholics to remain faithful to the Church and reconverting recent apostates to the Protestant creed. Secular priests hiding in England, alarmed at the boldness of the missionaries, warned them that they would soon be caught and arrested, and that their detection would make matters worse for the Catholics, and they begged them to return to the continent. But Parsons and Campion persisted. They moved from town to town, holding secret assemblies, hearing confessions, saying Mass, and giving their benediction to the whispering worshippers who looked upon them as messengers from God. Within a year of their coming they made, it was claimed, 20,000 converts. They set up a printing press and scattered propaganda. Tracts declaring that Elizabeth, having been excommunicated, was no longer the lawful Queen of England, were found in London streets. A third Jesuit was sent to Edinburgh to urge the Scottish Catholics to invade England from the north. The Earl of Westmoreland answered a summons from the Vatican. He brought back from Rome to Flanders a mass of bullion to finance an invasion from the Netherlands. By the summer of 1581, many Catholics believed, the Spanish troops of Alva would cross into England. Warned by its spies, the English government doubled its efforts to capture the Jesuits. Parsons found his way across the Channel, but Campion was caught, July 1581. He was carried through sympathetic villages and hostile London to the Tower. Elizabeth sent for him and tried to save him. She asked, did he consider her his lawful sovereign? He replied that he did. But to her next question, could the Pope lawfully excommunicate her, he answered that he could not decide an issue on which learned men were divided. She sent him back to the Tower, with instructions that he be kindly treated, but Cecil ordered him to be tortured into naming his fellow conspirators. After 2 days of agony, he yielded a few names, and more arrests were made. Recovering his audacity, Campion challenged Protestant divines to a public debate. By permission of the council, a debate was staged in the chapel of the Tower. Courtiers, prisoners, and public were admitted, and the Jesuits stood for hours on weakened legs to plead for the Catholic theology. Neither side convinced the other, but when Campion was brought to trial, the charge was not heresy, but conspiracy to overthrow the government by internal subversion and external attack. He and 14 others were convicted, and on December 1st, 1581, they were hanged. Those Catholics proved right who had predicted that the Jesuit mission would exasperate the government into further persecution. Elizabeth issued an appeal to her subjects to judge between her and those who sought her throne or her life. Parliament decreed, 1581, that conversion to Catholicism should be punished as high treason, that any priest who said Mass should be fined 200 marks and be imprisoned for a year, and that those who refused to attend Anglican services should pay £20 a month, enough to bankrupt any but the richest Catholics. Failure to pay the fine incurred arrest and confiscation of property. Soon the prisons were so crowded with Catholics that old castles had to be used as jails. Tension rose on all sides, heightened by the imminent execution of Mary Stuart and the intensified conflict with Spain and Rome. In June 1583, a papal nuncio offered Gregory XIII a detailed plan for the invasion of England by 3 armies at once from Ireland, France, and Spain. The Pope gave sympathetic consideration to this disegno per l'impresa d'Inghilterra, and specific measures were prepared, but English spies got wind of them, England made counter-preparations, and the invasion was postponed. Parliament retaliated with more repressive legislation. All priests ordained since June 1559 and still refusing the oath of supremacy were required to leave the country within 40 days or suffer death as treasonous conspirators, and all who harbored them were to be hanged. On the basis of this and other laws, 123 priests and 60 laymen were executed during the reign of Elizabeth, and probably another 200 died in jail. Some Protestants protested against the severity of this legislation. Some were converted to Catholicism. Cecil's grandson William fled to Rome, 1585, and pledged obedience to the Pope. Most English Catholics were opposed to any violent action against the government. One faction among them addressed an appeal to Elizabeth, 1585, affirmed their loyalty, and asked for a merciful consideration of their sufferings. But, as if to bear out the government's claim that its measures were justified by war, Cardinal Allen issued, 1588, a tract designed to rouse the English Catholics to support the approaching attack on England by Spain. He called the Queen an incestuous bastard, begotten and born in sin of an infamous courtesan, charged that, with Leicester and divers others, she hath abused her body by unspeakable and incredible variety of lust, demanded that the Catholics of England should rise against this depraved, accursed, excommunicate heretic, and promised a plenary indulgence to all who should aid in deposing the chief spectacle of sin and abomination in this age. The Catholics of England answered by fighting as bravely as the Protestants against the Spanish Armada. After that victory, the persecution continued as part of the continuing war. 61 priests and 49 laymen were hanged between 1588 and 1603, and many of these were cut down from the gibbet and were drawn and quartered. That is, they were disemboweled and torn limb from trunk while still alive. In a remarkable address presented to the Queen in the year of her death, 13 priests petitioned her to be allowed to remain in England. They repudiated all attacks on her right to the throne, and denied the authority of the Pope to depose her, but could not in conscience acknowledge anyone but the Pope as head of the Christian Church. The document reached the Queen only a few days before her death, and no result of it is recorded, but unwittingly it outlined the principles on which, 2 centuries later, the problem would be solved. The Queen died a victor in the greatest struggle of a reign stained with no darker blot than this victory. 7. Elizabeth and the Puritans. Against an apparently weaker enemy, a handful of Puritans, she did not prevail. They were men who had felt the influence of Calvin. Some of them had visited Calvin's Geneva as Marian refugees. Many of them had read the Bible in a translation made and annotated by Genevan Calvinists. Some had heard or read the blasts of John Knox's trumpet. Some may have heard echoes of Wycliffe's Lollard Poor Priests. Taking the Bible as their infallible guide, they found nothing in it about the episcopal powers and sacerdotal vestments that Elizabeth had transferred from the Roman to the Anglican Church. On the contrary, they found much about presbyters having no sovereign but Christ. They acknowledged Elizabeth as head of the Church in England, but only to bar the Pope. In their hearts they rejected any control of religion by the state, and aspired to control of the state by their religion. Toward 1564 they began to be called Puritans, as a term of abuse, because they demanded the purification of English Protestantism from all forms of faith and worship not found in the New Testament. They took the doctrines of predestination, election, and damnation deeply to heart, and felt that hell could be escaped only by subordinating every aspect of life to religion and morality. As they read the Bible in the solemn Sundays of their homes, the figure of Christ almost disappeared against the background of the Old Testament's jealous and vengeful Jehovah. The Puritan attack on Elizabeth took form, 1569, when the lectures of Thomas Cartwright, professor of theology at Cambridge, stressed the contrast between the Presbyterian organization of the early Christian Church and the Episcopalian structure of the Anglican establishment. Many of the faculty supported Cartwright, but John Whitgift, headmaster of Trinity College, denounced him to the Queen and secured his dismissal from the teaching staff, 1570. Cartwright emigrated to Geneva, where, under Théodore de Bèze, he imbibed the full ardor of Calvinist theocracy. Returning to England, he shared with Walter Travers and others in formulating the Puritan conception of the Church. Christ, in their view, had arranged that all ecclesiastical authority should be vested in ministers and lay elders elected by each parish, province, and state. The consistories, so formed, should determine creed, ritual, and moral code in conformity with Scripture. They should have access to every home, power to enforce at least outward observance of godly living, and the right to excommunicate recalcitrants and condemn heretics to death. The civil magistrates were to carry out these disciplinary decrees, but the state was to have no spiritual jurisdiction whatever. The first English parish organized on these principles was set up at Wandsworth in 1572, and similar presbyteries sprang up in the eastern and middle counties. By this time the majority of the London Protestants and of the House of Commons were Puritans. The artisans of London, powerfully infiltrated by Calvinist refugees from France and the Netherlands, applauded the Puritan attack on episcopacy and ritual. The businessmen of the capital looked upon Puritanism as the bulwark of Protestantism against a Catholicism traditionally unsympathetic to usury and the middle classes. Calvin was a bit too strict for them, but he had sanctioned interest and had recognized the virtues of industry and thrift. Even men close to the Queen had found some good in Puritanism. Cecil, Leicester, Walsingham, and Knowles hoped to use it as a foil to Catholicism if Mary Stuart reached the English throne. But Elizabeth felt that the Puritan movement threatened the whole settlement by which she had planned to ease the religious strife. She thought of Calvinism as the doctrine of John Knox, whom she had never forgiven for his scorn of women rulers. She despised the Puritan dogmatism even more heartily than the Catholic. She had a lingering fondness for the crucifix and other religious images, and when an iconoclastic fury destroyed paintings, statuary, and stained glass early in her reign, she awarded damages to the victims and forbade such actions in the future. She was not finicky in her own language, but she resented the description which some Puritan had given of the prayer book as culled and picked out of that popish dunghill, the Mass book, and of the Court of High Commission as a little stinking ditch. She saw in the popular election of ministers and in the government of the church by presbyteries and synods independent of the state a republican threat to monarchy. Only her monarchical power, she thought, could keep England Protestant. Popular suffrage would restore Catholicism. She encouraged bishops to trouble the troublemakers. Archbishop Parker suppressed their publications, silenced them in the churches, and obstructed their assemblies. Puritan clergymen had organized groups for the public discussion of scriptural passages. Elizabeth bade Parker put an end to these prophesyings, which he did. His successor, Edmund Grindal, tried to protect the Puritans. Elizabeth suspended him, and when he died, 1583, she advanced to the Canterbury See her new chaplain, John Whitgift, who dedicated himself to the silencing of the Puritans. He demanded of all English clergy an oath accepting the 39 Articles, the Prayer Book, and the Queen's religious supremacy. He subpoenaed all objectors before the High Commission Court, and there they were subjected to such detailed and insistent inquiry into their conduct and belief that Cecil compared the procedure to the Spanish Inquisition. The Puritan rebellion was intensified. A determined minority openly seceded from the Anglican Communion and set up independent congregations that elected their own ministers and acknowledged no episcopal control. In 1581, Robert Brown, a pupil, later an enemy of Cartwright, and chief voice of these independents, separatists, or Congregationalists, crossed over to Holland, and he published there 2 tracts outlining a democratic constitution for Christianity. Any group of Christians should have the right to organize itself for worship, formulate its own creed on the basis of Scripture, choose its own leaders, and live its religious life free from outside interference, acknowledging no rule but the Bible, no authority but Christ. 2 of Brown's followers were arrested in England, were judged in contempt of the Queen's religious sovereignty, and were hanged, 1583. In the campaign for election to the Parliament of 1586, the Puritans waged oratorical war upon any candidate unsympathetic to their cause. One such was branded as a common gamester and pot companion. Another was much suspect of popery, cometh very seldom to his church, and is a whoremaster. Those were days of virile speech. When Parliament convened, John Penry presented a petition for reform of the Church, and charged the bishops with responsibility for clerical abuses and popular paganism. Whitgift ordered his arrest, but he was soon released. Anthony Cope introduced a bill to abolish the entire episcopal establishment and reorganize English Christianity on the Presbyterian plan. Elizabeth ordered Parliament to remove the bill from discussion. Peter Wentworth rose to a question of parliamentary freedom, and 4 members supported him. Elizabeth had all 5 lodged in the Tower. Frustrated in Parliament, Penry and other Puritans took to the press. Eluding Whitgift's severe censorship of publications, They deluged England, 1588 to 89, with a succession of privately printed pamphlets, all signed Martin Marprelate, gentleman, and attacking the authority and personal character of the bishops in terms of satirical abuse. Whitgift and the High Commission deployed all the machinery of espionage to find the authors and printers, but the printers moved from town to town, and public sympathy helped them to escape detection until April 1589. Professional writers like John Lilly and Thomas Nash were engaged to answer Martin, and gave him good competition in scurrility. Finally, as Billingsgate ran out, the controversy subsided, and moderate men mourned the degradation of Christianity into an art of vituperation. Stung by these pamphlets, Elizabeth gave Whitgift a free hand to check the Puritans. The Marprelate printers were found, arrests multiplied, executions followed. Cartwright was sentenced to death but was pardoned by the Queen. Two leaders of the Brownian movement, John Greenwood and Henry Barrow, were hanged in 1593, and soon thereafter John Penry. Parliament decreed, 1593, that anyone who questioned the Queen's religious supremacy or persistently absented himself from Anglican services, or attended any assemblies, conventicles, or meetings under cover or pretense of any exercise of religion, should be imprisoned and, unless he gave a pledge of future conformity, should leave England and never return on pain of death. At this juncture, and amid the turmoil and fury, a modest parson raised the controversy to the level of philosophy, piety, and stately prose. Richard Hooker was one of two clergymen assigned to conduct services in the London Temple. The other was Walter Travers, Cartwright's friend. In the morning sermon, Hooker expounded the ecclesiastical polity of Elizabeth. In the afternoon, Travers criticized that church government from the Puritan view. Each developed his sermons into a book. As Hooker was writing literature as well as theology, he begged his bishop to transfer him to a quiet rural parsonage. So at Boscombe in Wiltshire, he completed the first 4 books of his great work of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, 1594. 3 years later, at Bishopsbourne, he sent Book 5 to the press, and there, in 1600, age 47, he died. His Laws astonished England by the calm and even-tempered dignity of its argument, and the sonorous majesty of its almost Latin style. Cardinal Allen praised it as the best book that had yet come out of England. Pope Clement VIII lauded its eloquence and learning. Queen Elizabeth read it gratefully as a splendid apology for her religious government. The Puritans were mollified by the gentle clarity of its tone, and posterity received it as a noble attempt to harmonize religion and reason. Hooker astonished his contemporaries by admitting that even a pope could be saved. He shocked the theologians by declaring that the assurance of what we believe by the word of God is to us not so certain as that which we perceive by sense. Man's reasoning faculty is also a divine gift and revelation. Hooker based his theory of law on medieval philosophy as formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, and he anticipated the social contract of Hobbes and Locke. After showing the need and boon of social organization, he argued that voluntary participation in a society implies consent to be governed by its laws. But the ultimate source of the laws is the community itself. A king or a parliament may issue laws only as the delegate or representatives of the community. Law makes the king. The king's grant of any favor contrary to the law is void. For peaceable contentment on both sides, the assent of those who are governed seemeth necessary. Laws are not which public approbation has not made so. And Hooker added a passage that might have warned Charles I. The Parliament of England, together with the ecclesiastical convocation annexed thereunto, is that whereupon the very essence of all government within this kingdom doth depend. It is even the body of the whole realm. It consisteth of the king and of all that within the land are subject to him, for they are all there present, either in person or by such as they voluntarily have derived, delegated, their power unto. To Hooker, religion seemed an integral part of the state, for social order and therefore even material prosperity depend on moral discipline, which collapses without religious inculcation and support. Consequently, every state should provide religious training for its people. The Anglican Church might be imperfect, but so would be all institutions made and manned by the children of Adam. He that goeth about to persuade a multitude that they are not so well off as they ought to be, shall never want attentive and favorable hearers, because they know the manifold defects whereunto every kind of regiment, government, is subject, but the secret lets and difficulties, which in public proceedings are innumerable and inevitable, they have not ordinarily the judgment to consider. Hooker's logic was too circular to be convincing, his learning too scholastic to meet the issues of his time, his shy spirit too thankful for order to understand the longing for liberty. The Puritans acknowledged his eloquence, but went on their way. Compelled to choose between their country and their faith, many of them emigrated, reversing the movement of continental Protestants into England. Holland welcomed them, and English congregations rose at Middelburg, Leyden, and Amsterdam. There the exiles and their offspring labored, taught, preached, and wrote, preparing with quiet passion for their triumphs in England and their fulfillment in America. 8. Elizabeth and Ireland. Ireland had been conquered by the English in 1169–71, and had been held ever since on the ground that otherwise it would be used by France or Spain as a base for attacks on England. At Elizabeth's accession, direct English rule in Ireland was confined to the eastern coast, the Pale, around and south of Dublin. The rest of the island was governed by Irish chieftains, only nominally acknowledging English sovereignty. The perennial conflict with the English disrupted the tribal administration that had given Ireland chaos and violence, but also poets, scholars, and saints. Most of the land was left to woods and bogs. Transport and communication were heroic enterprises, and the native Celtic population of some 800,000 souls lived in a half-lawless misery on the edge of barbarism. The English in the Pale were almost as poor, and they made Elizabeth's problem worse by debauchery, peculation, and crime. They robbed the London government as sedulously as they plundered the Irish peasantry. Throughout the reign, English settlers drove Irish proprietors and tenants from clearances. The dispossessed fought back with assassinations, and life for conquerors and conquered alike became a persisting fever of force and hate. Cecil himself thought that the Flemings had not such cause to rebel against the oppression of the Spaniards as the Irish against English rule. Elizabeth's Irish policy was based on the conviction that a Catholic Ireland would be a peril to a Protestant England. She ordered a full enforcement of Protestantism throughout the island. Mass was prohibited, the monasteries were closed, public worship ceased outside the narrow Pale. Priests survived in hiding and administered the sacraments furtively to a few. Morality, deprived of both religion and peace, almost disappeared. Murder, theft, adultery, and rape flourished, and men changed wives without grudge or qualm. Irish leaders appealed to the popes and Philip II for protection or aid. Philip feared to invade Ireland, lest the English should invade and help the rebellious Netherlands, but he established centers and colleges for Irish refugees in Spain. Pius IV sent to Ireland an Irish Jesuit, David Wolfe, 1560. With the courage and devotion characteristic of his order, Wolfe established clandestine missions, brought in other disguised Jesuits, and restored Catholic piety and hope. The chieftains took heart, and one after another rose in revolt against English rule. The most powerful of them was Shane, that is, John O'Neill of Tyrone. Here was such a man as legend could sing of and Irishmen could fight for. He fiercely defended his title of the O'Neill against a usurping brother. He ignored the commandments and adored the church. He foiled all English efforts to subdue him, risked his head to visit London and win Elizabeth's alliance and support, and returned in triumph to rule Ulster as well as Tyrone. He fought the rival O'Donnell clan ferociously and was finally defeated by it, 1567, and was killed when he took refuge with the MacDonalds, Scottish immigrants whose settlement at Antrim he had formerly attacked. The history of Ireland after his death was a parade of rebellions, massacres, and Lords Deputy. Sir Henry Sidney, father of Sir Philip, served Elizabeth faithfully in that ungrateful office for 9 years. He joined in defeating O'Neill, hunted Rory O'More to the death, and was recalled, 1578, because of the high cost of his victories. In 2 years as Lord Deputy, Walter Devereux, 1st Earl of Essex, distinguished himself by a massacre on the island of Rathlin, off the Antrim coast. Thither the rebel MacDonalds had sent for safety their wives and children, their aged and ailing, with a protective guard. Essex dispatched a force to capture the island. The garrison offered to surrender if they might be allowed to sail for Scotland. The offer was refused. They surrendered unconditionally. They and the women and children, the sick and the old, numbering 600, were put to the sword. 1575. The great revolt of the reign was that of the Geraldine clan in Munster. After many captivities and escapes, James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald crossed to the continent, raised a troop of Spaniards, Italians, Portuguese, Flemings, and English Catholic émigrés, and landed them on the coast of Kerry, 1579, only to lose his life in an incidental war with another clan. His cousin Gerald Fitzgerald, 15th Earl of Desmond, carried on the revolt, but the neighbouring Butler clan, under the Protestant Earl of Ormond, declared for England. The Catholics of the Pale organized an army and defeated the levies of the new Lord Deputy, Arthur Lord Grey, 1580. Reinforced, Grey besieged Desmond's main force by land and sea on a promontory in Smerwick Bay. Finding themselves defenseless against Grey's artillery, the 600 surviving rebels surrendered and begged for mercy. All were slaughtered, women and men, except for officers who could promise substantial ransoms. The war of English against Irish and of clan against clan so ravaged Munster that, said an Irish chronicler, the lowing of a cow or the voice of a ploughman was not to be heard that year from Dingle to the rock of Cashel. And an Englishman wrote, 1582, that there hath died by famine 30,000 in Munster in less than half a year, besides others that are hanged and killed. For to kill an Irishman in that province, wrote a great English historian, was thought no more of than to kill a mad dog. Almost denuded of Irish, Munster was divided into plantations for English settlers, 1586, one of them Edmund Spencer, who there completed the Fairy Queen. The desperate Irish rose again in 1593. Hugh O'Donnell, Lord of Tyrconnell, joined forces with Hugh O'Neill, 2nd Earl of Tyrone. Spain, now at open war with England, promised help. In an interregnum between Lords Deputy, O'Neill routed an English army at Armagh, captured Blackwater, an English stronghold in the north, 1598, and sent a force to renew the Munster revolt. The English colonists fled, abandoning their plantations. Hope and joy spread in Ireland, and even the English expected that Dublin itself would fall. It was in this crisis that Elizabeth appointed the youthful Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, as her Lord Deputy in Ireland, March 1599. She gave him an army of 17,500 men, the greatest that England had ever sent to the island. She bade him attack O'Neill and Tyrone, make no peace without consulting her, and not return without her permission. Arrived in Dublin, he dallied through the spring, undertook a few skirmishes, let his army waste away with disease, signed an unauthorized truce with O'Neill, and returned to England, September 1599, to explain his failure to the Queen. Quickly replacing him, Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, faced with courage and skill a combination of tricky O'Neill, fearless O'Donnell, and a fleet landing at Kinsale with troops and arms from Spain and indulgences from Clement VIII for all who would defend Ireland and the faith. Mountjoy rushed south to meet the Spaniards and defeated them so decisively that O'Neill submitted. The revolt collapsed, and a general amnesty brought a precarious peace, 1603. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had died. Her record in Ireland subtracted from her glory. She underestimated the difficulty of conquering, in an almost roadless country, a people whose love of their land and their faith was their only bond to life and decency. She scolded her deputies for failures that were due in part to her own parsimony. They were unable to pay their troops, who found it more profitable to rob the Irish than to fight them. She vacillated between truce and terror, and never followed one policy to a decision. She founded Trinity College and Dublin University, 1591, but she left the people of Ireland as illiterate as before. After the expenditure of £10 million, the peace achieved was a desert of desolation over half the lovely isle, and over all of it, a spirit of unspeakable hatred that only bided its time to kill and devastate again. 9. Elizabeth and Spain. The Queen was at her best in her management of Spain. She allowed Philip to think she might marry him or his son, and in his hopes of winning England with a wedding ring, he played the game of patience till his friends were alienated and Elizabeth was strong. Pope and Emperor and a hapless Scottish Queen might beg him to invade England, but he was too doubtful of France, too troubled in the Netherlands, to venture upon so incalculable a throw of the political dice. He had no assurance that France would not pounce upon the Spanish Netherlands the moment he became embroiled with England. He was loath to encourage revolution anywhere. He trusted, in his heavy procrastinating way, that Elizabeth would in due time find one or another of the many exits that an ingenious nature has provided from our life. And yet he was in no haste to give the throne of England to a Scottish lass in love with France. For years he held back the Pope from promulgating the excommunication of Elizabeth. He bore in somber silence her treatment of Catholics in England, and her protests against the treatment of English Protestants in Spain. For almost 30 years he kept the peace, while English privateers made war upon Spanish colonies and trade. The nature of man confesses itself in the conduct of states, for these are but ourselves in gross, and behave for the most part as men presumably did before morals and laws were laid upon them by religion and force. Conscience follows the policeman, but there were no police for states. On the seas there were no 10 commandments, and trade existed by permission of piracy. Small pirate craft used the inlets of the British coast as lairs, and thence sallied forth to seize what they could. If the victims were Spanish, the English could enjoy the religious fervor of plundering a papist. Bold men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake fitted out substantial privateers and took all the oceans for their province. Elizabeth disowned but did not disturb them, for she saw in the privateers the makings of a navy, and in these buccaneers her future admirals. The Huguenot port of La Rochelle became a favorite rendezvous of English, Dutch, and Huguenot vessels, which preyed on Catholic commerce under whatever flag it sailed, and in need on Protestant commerce too. From such piracy the buccaneers passed to that lucrative trade in slaves which the Portuguese had opened up a century before. In the Spanish colonies of America, the natives were dying out from toil too arduous for their climate and constitutions. A demand arose for a sturdier breed of laborers. Las Casas himself, defender of the natives, suggested to Charles I of Spain that African Negroes, stronger than the Caribbean Indians, should be transported to America to do the heavy work for the Spaniards there. Charles consented, but Philip II condemned the trade and instructed the Spanish-American governors to prevent the importation of slaves, except under license, costly and rare, by the home administration. Aware that some governors were evading these restrictions, Hawkins led 3 ships to Africa, 1562, captured 300 Negroes, took them to the West Indies, and sold them to Spanish settlers in exchange for sugar, spices, and drugs. Back in England, he induced Lord Pembroke and others to invest in a second venture and persuaded Elizabeth to put one of her best vessels at his disposal. In 1564, he headed south with 4 ships, seized 400 African Negroes, sailed for the West Indies, sold them to Spaniards under threat of his guns if they refused to buy, and returned home to be hailed as a hero and share his spoils with his backers and the Queen, who made 60% on her investment. In 1567, she lent him her ship, the Jesus. With this and 4 other vessels, he sailed to Africa, captured all the Negroes his holds could stow, sold them in Spanish America at £160 a head, and was homeward bound with loot valued at £100,000 when a Spanish fleet caught him off the Mexican coast at San Juan de Ulua and destroyed all of his fleet but 2 small tenders, in which Hawkins, after 1,000 perils, returned empty-handed to England, 1569. Among the survivors of that voyage was Hawkins's young kinsman, Francis Drake. Educated at Hawkins's expense, Drake became, so to speak, a native of the sea. At 22, he commanded a ship on Hawkins's futile expedition. At 23, having lost everything but his reputation for bravery, he vowed vengeance against Spain. At 25, he received a privateer's commission from Elizabeth. In 1573, aged 28, he captured a convoy of silver bullion off the coast of Panama and returned to England rich and revenged. Elizabeth's counselors kept him in hiding for 3 years while Spain cried out for his death. Then Leicester, Walsingham, and Hatton fitted out for him 4 small vessels, totaling 375 tons. With these he sailed from Plymouth on November 15, 1577, on what turned out to be the 2nd circumnavigation of the globe. As his fleet issued from the Straits of Magellan into the Pacific, it ran into a heavy storm. The ships were scattered and never reunited. Drake alone in the Pelican moved up the west coast of the Americas to San Francisco, raiding Spanish vessels on the way. Then he turned boldly westward to the Philippines, sailed through the Moluccas to Java, across the Indian Ocean to Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up the Atlantic to reach Plymouth on September 26, 1580, 34 months after leaving it. He brought with him 600,000 pounds of booty, of which 275,000 pounds were handed over to the Queen. England hailed him as the greatest seaman and pirate of the age. Elizabeth dined on his ship and dubbed him knight. All this time England had been technically at peace with Spain. Philip lodged repeated protests with the Queen. She made excuses, hugged her spoils, and pointed out that Philip was also violating international law by sending help to the rebels in Ireland. When the Spanish ambassador threatened war, she threatened marriage with Alençon and alliance with France. Philip, busy conquering Portugal, ordered his envoy to keep the peace. As usual, good luck supplemented the vacillating genius of the Queen. What would have happened to her if Catholic France had not been cut in two by civil war, if Catholic Austria and the Emperor had not been harassed by the Turks, if Spain had not been embroiled with Portugal, France, the papacy, and its rebellious subjects in the Netherlands? For years Elizabeth played fast and loose with the Netherlands, shifting her policy with fluid circumstance, and no charges of irresolution or treachery could make her move in blinders on one course. She had no more liking for Dutch Calvinism than for English Puritanism, and no more liking than Philip for a betting revolution. She recognized the importance to the English economy of uninterrupted trade with the Netherlands. She planned to support the revolt of the Netherlands sufficiently to keep them from surrendering to Spain or bequeathing themselves to France. For as long as the revolt continued, Spain would stay out of England. A blessed windfall, allowed the Queen to help the rebels at a delectable profit to her treasury. In December 1568, several Spanish vessels, carrying £150,000 to pay Alva's troops in the Netherlands, were driven by English privateers into Channel ports. Elizabeth, who had just heard of Hawkins's disaster at San Juan de Ulua, recognized a providential opportunity to make up for what England had lost in that defeat. She asked Bishop Jewell whether she had a right to the Spanish treasure. He judged that God, being surely a Protestant, would be pleased to see the Papists plundered. Moreover, the Queen learned the money had been borrowed by Philip from Genoese bankers, and Philip had refused to take title to it until its safe delivery in Antwerp. Elizabeth had the money transferred to her vaults. Philip complained. Alva seized all English nationals and goods that he could lay hands upon in the Netherlands. Elizabeth arrested all Spaniards in England. But the necessities of trade gradually restored normal relations. Alva refused to prod Elizabeth into alliance with the rebels. Philip kept his temper. Elizabeth kept the money. The uneasy peace dragged on until continued English raids on Spanish shipping and the appeals of the imprisoned Mary Stuart's friends involved Philip in a plot to assassinate the Queen. Convinced of his participation, Elizabeth expelled the Spanish ambassador, 1584, and gave open aid to the Netherlands. English troops entered Flushing, Brill, Ostend, and Sluis. Leicester was sent to command them. They were defeated by the Spaniards at Zutphen, 1586, but now at last the issue was drawn. Both Philip and Elizabeth prepared with all their resources for the war that would decide the mastery of the seas and the religion of England, perhaps of Europe, perhaps of the New World. Spain had risen to wealth by grace of Columbus and Pope Alexander VI, whose arbitration decrees of 1493 had awarded nearly all of the Americas to his native Spain. With those voyages and bulls, the Mediterranean ceased to be the center of the white man's civilization and power, and the Atlantic Age began. Of Europe's three great Atlantic nations, France was debarred by civil war from the contest for oceanic dominion. England and Spain remained, jutting out like grasping promontories toward the Promised Land. It appeared impossible to dislodge Spain from her preeminence in America. By 1580 she had hundreds of colonies there, England none, and each year immense riches passed from the mines of Mexico and Peru to Spain. It seemed manifest destiny that Spain should rule all the Western Hemisphere and make both the Americas in her political and religious image. Drake was not content with this prospect. For a time, the war for the world was between himself and Spain. In 1585, financed by his friends and the Queen, he fitted out 30 vessels and sallied forth against the Spanish Empire. He entered the estuary of Vigo in northwest Spain, plundered the port of Vigo, disrobed a statue of the Virgin, and carried away the precious metals and costly vestments of the churches. He sailed on to the Canary and Cape Verde Islands, pillaged the largest of them, crossed the Atlantic, raided Santo Domingo, took £30,000 as a douceur not to destroy the Colombian city of Cartagena, plundered and burned the town of St. Augustine in Florida, and returned to England, 1586, only because yellow fever had killed a third of his crew. This was war without its name. On February 8, 1587, the English government put to death the Scottish Queen. Philip informed Sixtus V that he was now ready to invade England and dethrone Elizabeth. He asked the Pope to contribute 2 million gold crowns. Sixtus offered 600,000 to be paid to Spain only if the invasion actually occurred. Philip bade his best admiral, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, to prepare the largest armada so far known in history. Ships were gathered or built at Lisbon, stores were assembled at Cadiz. Drake urged Elizabeth to give him a fleet to destroy the armada before it could take irresistible form. She consented, and on April 2, 1587, with 30 ships, he hurried out from Plymouth before she could change her mind. She did, but too late to reach him. On April 16th, he ran his fleet into Cadiz harbor, maneuvered out of range of the batteries on the shore, sank a Spanish man-of-war, raided the transports and storeships, captured their cargoes, set all enemy vessels on fire, and departed unharmed. He anchored off Lisbon and challenged Santa Cruz to come out and fight. The Marquis refused, for his ships were not yet armed. Drake moved north to La Coruña and seized great stores collected there, then to the Azores, where he took a Spanish galleon. With it in tow, he returned to England. Even the Spaniards marveled at his audacity and seamanship, and said that, were it not that he was a Lutheran, there was not the like man in the world. Philip patiently rebuilt his fleet. The Marquis of Santa Cruz died, January 1588. Philip replaced him with the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a grandee with more pedigree than competence. When finally the Armada was complete, it numbered 130 vessels, averaging 445 tons. Half the ships were cargo carriers, half were men of war. 8,050 sailors manned them, 19,000 soldiers sailed. Philip and his admirals thought of naval warfare in ancient terms, to grapple and board the enemy and fight man to man. The English plan was to sink the enemy's ships with their crowded crews by broadside fire. Philip instructed his fleet not to seek out and attack the English squadrons, but to seize some English beachhead, cross to Flanders, and take on board the 30,000 troops that the Duke of Parma had ready there. So reinforced, the Spanish were to march on London. Meanwhile, a letter composed by Cardinal Allen, April 1588, was smuggled into England, bidding the Catholics join the Spanish in deposing their usurping, heretic, prostitute queen. To help restore Catholicism in England, hundreds of monks accompanied the Armada, under the Vicar General of the Inquisition. A devout religious spirit moved the Spanish sailors and their masters. They sincerely believed they were on a sacred mission. Prostitutes were sent away, profanity subsided, gambling ceased. On the morning when the fleet sailed from Lisbon, May 29, 1588, every man on board received the Eucharist, and all Spain prayed. The winds favored Elizabeth. The Armada ran into a damaging storm. It took refuge in the harbor of La Coruña, healed its wounds, and set forth again, July 12th. England awaited it in a feverish mixture of divided counsels, hurried preparations, and desperate resolve. Now the time had come for Elizabeth to spend the sums that she had saved through 30 years of skimping and deviltry. Her people, Catholic as well as Protestant, came manfully to her rescue. Volunteer militia trained in the towns. London merchants financed regiments and, asked to fit out 15 ships, provided 30. For 10 years now, Hawkins had been building men of war for the Queen's Navy. Drake was now a vice-admiral. Privateers brought their own vessels to the fateful rendezvous. Early in July 1588, the full complement of 82 ships under command of Charles, Lord Howard of Effingham, as Lord High Admiral of England, gathered at Plymouth to greet the advancing foe. On July 19th, the vanguard of the Armada was sighted in the mouth of the Channel. The defending fleet sailed out of Plymouth, and on the 21st the action began. The Spaniards waited for the English to come close enough for grappling. Instead, the light English vessels, built to low lines and narrow beam, scurried around the heavy Spanish galleons, firing broadsides as they went. The Spanish decks were too high. Their guns fired too far above the English vessels, doing only minor damage. The English boats ran beneath the fire, and their maneuverability and speed left the Spaniards helpless and confused. As night fell, they fled before the wind, leaving one of their ships to be taken by Drake. Another was blown up, reportedly by a mutinous German gunner, and the wreck fell into English hands. Luckily, both ships contained ammunition, which was soon transferred to the Queen's fleet. On the 24th, more ammunition came, but still the English had only enough for a day's fighting. On the 25th, near the Isle of Wight, Howard led an attack. His flagship sailed into the center of the Armada, exchanging broadsides with every galleon that had passed, and the superior accuracy of the English fire broke the Spanish morale. "The enemy pursue me," wrote Medina Sidonia that night to the Duke of Parma. "They fire on me from morn till dark, but they will not grapple. There is no remedy, for they are swift and we are slow." He begged Parma to send him ammunition and reinforcements, but Parma's ports were blockaded by Dutch ships. On the 27th, the Armada anchored in Calais roads. On the 28th, Drake set fire to 8 small and dispensable vessels and placed them in the wind to sail amid the Spanish fleet. Fearing them, Medina Sidonia ordered his ships to put out to sea. On the 29th, Drake attacked them off the French coast at Gravelines in the main action of the war. The Spaniards fought bravely, but with poor seamanship and gunnery. At noon, Howard's squadron came up, and the full English fleet poured such fire into the Armada that many of its ships were disabled and some were sunk. Their wooden hulls, though 3 feet thick, were penetrated by the English shot. Thousands of Spaniards were killed. Blood could be seen flowing from the decks into the sea. At the close of that day, the Armada had lost 4,000 men. 4,000 more were wounded, and the surviving vessels were with difficulty kept afloat. Seeing that his crews could bear no more, Medina Sidonia gave orders to withdraw. On the 30th, the wind carried the broken fleet into the North Sea. The English followed them as far north as the Firth of Forth. Then, lacking food and ammunition, they returned to port. They had lost 60 men and not 1 ship. For the remnants of the Armada, there was no haven nearer than Spain itself. Scotland was hostile, and Irish ports were held by English troops. Desperately, the injured ships and starving men made their way around the British Isles. The water was rough and the wind was wild. Masts were shattered and sails were torn. Day after day some vessel sank or was abandoned. Dead men were dropped into the sea. 17 ships were wrecked on the rugged Irish shores. At Sligo alone, 1,100 drowned Spaniards were washed up on the beach. Some of the crews made landings in Ireland and begged for food and drink. They were refused, and hundreds, too weak to fight, were massacred by the half-savage denizens of the coasts. Of the 130 vessels that had left Spain, 54 returned. Of 27,000 men, 10,000, most of them wounded or sick. Philip, learning of the prolonged disaster day by day, shut himself up in his Escorial cell, and none dared speak to him. Sixtus V, pleading that no invasion of England had occurred, sent not 1 ducat to bankrupt Spain. Elizabeth was as careful with ducats as the Pope. Wary of peculation in the Navy, she demanded accounting of every shilling spent by Navy and Army before, during, and after the battle. Howard and Hawkins made up out of their own pockets whatever discrepancies they could not explain. Elizabeth, expecting a long war, had kept the crews and troops on short rations and low pay. Now a violent disease akin to typhus ran through the returning men. On some vessels half the crew died or were disabled, and Hawkins wondered what England's fate would have been had the epidemic preceded the enemy. The naval war continued till Philip's death, 1598. Drake took a fleet and 15,000 men to help the Portuguese in their revolt against Spain, 1589, but the Portuguese hated Protestants more than Spaniards. The English drank themselves drunk on captured wine, and the expedition ended in failure and disgrace. Lord Thomas Howard led a fleet to the Azores to intercept the Spanish flota, bringing silver and gold to Spain. But Philip's new armada put Howard's ships to flight, except the Revenge, which, caught lagging behind the rest, fought 15 Spanish ships heroically until overcome. 1591. Drake and Hawkins made another sally to the West Indies, 1595, but they quarreled and died on the way. In 1596, Elizabeth sent still another fleet to destroy ships in Spanish ports. At Cadiz, it found 19 men of war and 36 merchantmen, but these escaped to the open sea while Essex plundered the town. This expedition, too, was a failure, but it demonstrated again the English mastery of the Atlantic. The defeat of the Armada affected almost everything in modern European civilization. It marked a decisive change in naval tactics. Grappling and boarding gave way to cannonading from shipside and deck. The weakening of Spain helped the Dutch to win their independence, advanced Henry IV to the throne of France, and opened North America to English colonies. Protestantism was preserved and strengthened, Catholicism waned in England, and James VI of Scotland ceased to flirt with the popes. Had the Armada been more wisely built and led, Catholicism might have recovered England, the Guises might have prevailed in France, Holland might have succumbed. The great burst of pride and energy that raised up Shakespeare and Bacon as the symbols and fruit of a triumphant England might never have been, and the Elizabethan ecstasy would have had to meet the Spanish Inquisition. So wars determine theology and philosophy, and the ability to kill and destroy is a prerequisite for permission to live and build. 10. Raleigh and Essex, 1588 to 1601. Though Cecil and Walsingham, Drake and Hawkins had been the immediate instruments of glory and victory, Elizabeth personified triumphant England, and at 60 she was at the top of her fame and power. Her face was a bit wrinkled, her hair was detachable, some teeth were missing and some were black, but in her awesome finery of lacy headdress, flying ruff, padded sleeves, and hoop skirt, all a-sparkle with encrusted gems, she stood proud and straight and undeniably a queen. Parliament grumbled at her royal ways, but submitted. Old councillors offered advice with the timidity of young suitors, and young suitors, fluent with adoration, surrounded the throne. Leicester and Walsingham paid their debt to nature. Drake and Hawkins would soon be swallowed by the sea they had thought to rule. Cecil, the Atlas of this Commonwealth, Bacon called him, was now old, and he creaked with gout. Presently Elizabeth would nurse him in his final illness and feed him his last food with her own hand. She grew sad with these amputations, but she did not let them darken the splendor of her progresses or the vivacity of her court. New faces shone about her, bringing her some vicarious youth. Christopher Hatton was so handsome that she made him Chancellor, 1587. She waited 9 years before accepting Burleigh's advice to make his sagacious hunchbacked son, Robert Cecil, her Secretary of State. She relished more the fine features and rattling sword of Walter Raleigh, and did not mind his private theological doubts. She had some of her own. Raleigh was almost the complete Elizabethan man. Gentleman, soldier, mariner, adventurer, poet, philosopher, orator, historian, martyr. Here was the uomo universale of Renaissance dreams, who touched genius at every point, but never let the part become the whole. Born in Devonshire in 1552, entered at Oxford in 1568, he fled from books into life and joined a gallant group of pedigreed volunteers who crossed to France to fight for the Huguenots. 6 years in those wars may have taught him some of the unscrupulous violence of action and reckless audacity of speech that molded his later fate. Back in England, 1575, he forced himself to study law, but in 1578 he went off again as a volunteer to help the Dutch against Spain. 2 years later he was in Ireland as a captain in the army that put down Desmond's rebellion, and he played no hesitant part in the Smerwick massacre. Elizabeth rewarded him with 12,000 acres in Ireland and favour at her court. Pleased with his figure, his compliments, and his wit, she listened with less than her customary skepticism to his proposal for English colonies in America. She gave him a charter, and in 1584 he sent out, but did not accompany, the first of several expeditions that tried, and failed, to establish a settlement in Virginia. Only the name survived, as a lasting memorial to the Queen's inaccessibility. Elizabeth Throckmorton, a maid of honor, proved more approachable. She accepted Raleigh as her lover and secretly married him, 1593. As no member of the court might marry without the Queen's consent, The ardent couple received an unexpected honeymoon in the Tower. Raleigh earned release, with banishment from the court, by writing to Burleigh a letter describing the Queen as an amalgam of all the perfections in history. He retired to his Sherborne estate, planned voyages and discoveries, played with atheism, and wrote poetry whose every line had a characteristic tang and sting. But 2 years of quiet exhausted his stability. With the help of Lord Admiral Howard and Robert Cecil, he fitted out 5 vessels and headed for South America, seeking El Dorado, a fabled land of golden palaces, rivers running gold, and Amazons with undiminished charms. He sailed 100 miles up the Orinoco, but found no female warriors and no gold. Baffled by rapids and falls, he returned to England empty-handed. But he told how the American natives had marveled at the beauty of the Queen when he showed them her portrait, and soon he was readmitted to the court. His eloquent account, the discovery of the large, rich, and beautiful empire of Guiana, reaffirmed his faith that the sun covereth not so much riches in any part of the world as the region of the Orinoco. Tirelessly he preached the desirability of getting America's wealth out of Spanish into English hands. And he phrased the doctrine of sea power perfectly. Whoever commands the sea commands the trade. Whoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently the world itself. In 1596 he joined the expedition to Cadiz, fought as vigorously as he wrote, and received a wound in the leg. The Queen now used him graciously and made him captain of the guard. In 1597 he commanded part of the fleet that Essex led to the Azores. Separated from the rest by a storm, Raleigh's squadron encountered and defeated the enemy. Essex never forgave him for preempting victory. Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, surpassed even Raleigh in fascination. He had Walter's ambition and verve and pride, a little more of his hot temper, a little less of his wit, much more of generosity and noblesse oblige. He was a man of action, enamored of intellect, victor in jousts and on the athletic field, distinguished for bravery and audacity in war, yet also the helpful and appreciative friend of poets and philosophers. When his mother became Leicester's second wife, Leicester advanced him at court to offset Raleigh's ingratiating charm. The Queen, 53, fell maternally in love with the high-strung, handsome lad of 20, 1587. Here was a son to console her childlessness. They talked, rode, heard music, played cards together, and, "My lord," said a gossip, "cometh not to his own lodging till birds sing in the morning." Her aging heart suffered when he secretly married Philip Sidney's widow, but she soon forgave him, and by 1593 he was a member of the Privy Council. However, he was poorly fitted for court life or statesmanship. "He carried his love and hate always on his face," said his servant Cuff, "and knew not how to hide them." He made enemies of Raleigh, William Cecil, Robert Cecil, finally of the ungrateful Bacon and the reluctant Queen. Francis Bacon, who was destined to have more influence on European thought than any other Elizabethan, had been born, 1561, in the very aura of the court, at York House, official residence of the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, who was his father, Sir Nicholas. Elizabeth called the boy the young Lord Keeper. His frail constitution drove him from sports to studies. His agile intellect grasped knowledge hungrily. Soon his erudition was among the wonders of those spacious times. After 3 years at Cambridge, he was sent to France with the English ambassador to let him learn the ways of state. While he was there, his father unexpectedly died, 1579, before buying an estate that he had intended for Francis, who was a younger son, and the youth, suddenly reduced to meagre means, returned to London to study law at Gray's Inn. Being a nephew of William Cecil, he appealed to him for some political place. After 4 years of waiting, he sent him a whimsical reminder that the objection of my years will wear away with the length of my suit. Somehow, in that year, 1584, he was elected to Parliament, though still but 23. He distinguished himself by favoring more toleration of the Puritans. His mother was one. The Queen ignored his arguments, but he restated them bravely in a privately circulated advertisement touching the controversies of the Church of England. 1589. He proposed that no man should be molested for his religious faith, who promised to defend England against any foreign power, including the papacy, that threatened England's full sovereignty and freedom. Elizabeth and Cecil thought the young philosopher a bit forward, and in truth he was ahead of his times. Essex relished the keenness of Bacon's mind and invited his advice. The young sage counseled the young noble to seem, if he could not be, modest, to moderate his expenditures, to seek civil rather than military office, since setbacks in politics could be sooner redeemed than defeats in war, and to regard his popularity with the populace as a danger with the Queen. Bacon hoped that Essex would mature into a statesman and give his mentor some opportunity to rise. In 1592 he appealed again to Cecil in famous lines. "I wax now somewhat ancient. 31 years is a great deal of sand in the hourglass. The meanness of my estate doth somewhat move me. I confess that I have as vast contemplative ends as I have moderate civil ends, for I have taken all knowledge to be my province. This, whether it be curiosity or vainglory or nature, is so fixed in my mind as it cannot be removed." When Essex importuned the Cecils and Elizabeth to give Bacon the vacant office of Attorney General, his appeals were in vain. Edward Coke, older and technically more fit, was chosen instead. Essex took the blame handsomely and gave Bacon an estate at Twickenham with £1,800. Before Bacon could use this, he suffered a brief and genteel imprisonment for debt. In 1597 he was appointed to the Learned Council of lawyers who advised the Privy Council. Despite Bacon's advice, Essex joined the war party and planned to make himself head of the army. His dashing bravery at Cadiz made him too popular for the council's taste. Failure at the Azores, and his undiminished pride, extravagance, and sharp tongue alienated the court and irritated the Queen. When she flatly rejected his recommendation of Sir George Carew for office in Ireland, he turned his back on her with a gesture of contempt. Furious, she boxed his ears and cried, "Go to the devil!" He grasped his sword and shouted at her, "This is an outrage that I will not put up with. I would not have borne it from your father's hands." He rushed in anger from the room, and all the court expected him to be clapped into the Tower, 1598. Elizabeth did nothing. On the contrary, or was it to get rid of him, a few months later she appointed him Lord Deputy for Ireland. Bacon had cautioned him not to seek that ungrateful task of countering a faith by force, but Essex wanted an army. On March 27, 1599, he left for Dublin amid the acclamations of the populace, the misgivings of his friends, and the satisfaction of his enemies. 6 months later, having failed in his mission, he hurried back to England without permission of the Queen, rushed unannounced into her dressing-room, and tried to explain his actions in Ireland. She listened to him with patient wrath and had him committed to the custody of the Lord Keeper at York House until the charges against him could be heard. The people of London murmured, for they were ignorant of his failure and remembered his victories. The Privy Council ordered a semi-public trial, and commissioned Bacon, as a member of the Learned Council and as a lawyer pledged to defend the Queen, to draw up a statement of the charges. He asked to be excused. They insisted. He consented. The indictment he formulated was moderate. Essex acknowledged its truth and offered humble submission. He was suspended from his offices and was told to remain in his own home till the Queen should be pleased to free him, June 5, 1600. Bacon pleaded for him, and on August 26, Essex was restored to liberty. Now in his own Essex house, he continued his search for power. One of his intimates was Shakespeare's patron, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. Him Essex sent to Ireland to propose that Mountjoy, now Lord Deputy there, should return to England with the English army and help Essex take control of the government. Mountjoy refused. Early in 1601, Essex wrote to James VI of Scotland, asking his aid and promising to support him as successor to Elizabeth. James sent him a letter of encouragement. Wild rumors spread through the excited capital that Robert Cecil was planning to make the Spanish Infanta Queen of England, that Essex was to be immured in the Tower, that Raleigh had vowed to kill him. Perhaps to force Essex to show his hand, the younger Cecil induced the Queen to send Essex a message requiring him to attend the council. His friends warned him that this was a ruse to seize him. One friend, Sir Gilly Merrick, paid the Chamberlain's company to stage that evening in Southwark Shakespeare's Richard II, showing a sovereign justly deposed. The next morning, February 7th, 1601, some 300 supporters of Essex, fervent and armed, gathered in the courtyard of his home. When the Lord Keeper and 3 other dignitaries came to ask the cause of this illegal assembly, the crowd locked them up and swept the hesitant Earl on with them to London and revolution. He had hoped that the people would rise to his cause, but the preachers bade them stay indoors, and they obeyed. The forces of the government were on guard and routed the rebels. Essex was captured and lodged in the Tower. He was quickly brought to trial on a charge of treason. The council bade Bacon help Cook in preparing the government's case. His refusal would have ruined his political career. His consent ruined his posthumous reputation. When Cook faltered in presenting the indictment, Bacon rose and stated the matter with convincing, convicting clarity. Essex confessed his guilt and named his accomplices. 5 of these were arrested and beheaded. Southampton was sentenced to life imprisonment. James I later released him. Legend told how Essex sent the Queen a ring once given him by her with a promise to come to his aid if he should ever return it in his hour of need. If sent, it did not reach her. On February 25th, 1601, aged 35, Essex went gallantly to the fate that was the seal of his character. Raleigh, his enemy, wept when the blow fell. For a year the Tower displayed the severed and decaying head. 11. The Magic Fades, 1601 to 1603. The sight of that head, or the knowledge that it was staring down upon her night and day, must have shared in the somber mood of Elizabeth's final years. She sat alone for hours in silent, pensive melancholy. She maintained the amusements of her court, and made at times a brave pretense of gaiety, but her health was gone and her heart was dead. England had ceased to love her. It felt that she had outlived herself and should make room for younger royalty. The last of her parliaments rebelled more vigorously than any before against her infringement of parliamentary freedom, her persecution of Puritans, her rising demands for funds, her gifts of trade monopolies to her favorites. To everyone's surprise, the Queen yielded on the last point and promised to end the abuse. All the members of the Commons went to thank her, and they knelt as she gave what proved to be her last address to them, her wistful, golden speech, November 20th, 1601. There is no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which I prefer before your love, for I do esteem it more than any treasure. And though God has raised us high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. She bade them rise, and then continued, To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it, than it is pleasant to them that bear it. For my own part, were it not for conscience' sake to discharge the duty that God hath laid upon me, and to maintain his glory and keep you in safety, in mine own disposition I should be willing to resign the place I hold to any other, and glad to be freed of the glory with the labours. For it is not my desire to live or to reign longer than my life and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had, and may have, many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any love you better. She had postponed as long as she could the question of a successor, for while the Queen of Scots lived as legal heir to her throne, Elizabeth could not reconcile herself to letting Mary undo the Protestant settlement. Now that Mary was dead, and Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was heir apparent, it was some comfort to know that, however vacillating and devious, he was Protestant. She knew that Robert Cecil and others of her court were secretly negotiating with James to ease his accession and feather their nests, and were counting the days when she should die. Rumors moved across Europe that she was dying of cancer. But she was dying of too much life. Her frame could not bear any more the joys and sorrows, the burdens and blows of the relentless years. When her godson, Sir John Harrington, tried to amuse her with witty verses, she sent him off, saying, "When thou dost feel creeping time at thy gate, these fooleries will please thee less." In March 1603, having exposed herself too boldly to the winter cold, she caught a fever. Through 3 weeks it consumed her. She spent them mostly in a chair or reclining on cushions. She would have no doctors, but she asked for music, and some players came. Finally she was persuaded to take to her bed. Archbishop Whitgift expressed a hope for her longer life. She rebuked him. He knelt beside the bed and prayed. When he thought it was enough, he tried to rise, but she bade him continue. And again, when the old man's knees were weary, she motioned him to pray some more. He was released only when, late at night, she fell asleep. She never woke. The next day, March 24th, John Manningham wrote in his diary, "This morning about 3 o'clock Her Majesty departed this life, mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree." So it seemed. England, which had long awaited her passing, felt the blow nevertheless. Many men realized that a great age had ended, a powerful hand had fallen from the helm, and some, like Shakespeare, feared a chaotic interlude. Bacon thought her such a great queen that, if Plutarch were now alive to write lives by parallels, it would trouble him to find for her a parallel among women. This lady was endued with learning in her sex singular, and rare even among masculine princes. As for her government, this part of the island never had 45 years of better times, and yet not through the calmness of the season, but through the wisdom of her regiment. For if there be considered, of the one side, the truth of religion established, the constant peace and security, the good administration of justice, the temperate use of the prerogative, the flourishing state of learning, and if there be considered on the other side the differences of religion, the troubles of neighbor countries, the ambition of Spain and opposition of Rome, and then that she was solitary and of herself, these things, I say, considered, as I could not have chosen another instance so recent and so proper, so I suppose I could not have chosen one more remarkable or eminent, concerning the conjunction of learning in the prince with felicity in the people. Looking back now in the hindsight of time, we should shade the portrait a little, noting and forgiving the faults of the incomparable queen. She was no saint or sage, but a woman of temper and passion, lustily in love with life. The truth of religion was not quite established, and not all her subjects could, as Shakespeare may have thought, eat in safety under their own vines what they planted and sing the merry songs of peace. The wisdom of her rule was partly that of her aids. The vacillations of her mind proved often fortunate, perhaps by the chance of change. Sometimes they brought such weakness of policy that the internal troubles of her enemies had to help her to survive. But survive she did, and she prospered, by fair means or devious. She freed Scotland from the French and bound it with England. She enabled Henry of Navarre to balance his mass in Paris with the Edict of Nantes. She found England bankrupt and despised, and left it rich and powerful, and the sinews of learning and literature grew strong in the wealth of her people. She continued the despotism of her father, but moderated it with humanity and charm. Denied husband and child, she mothered England, loved it devotedly, and used herself up in serving it. She was the greatest ruler that England has ever known.